Podcast.
And this is the Warrior Priest Podcast, Season 1, Episode 3. We are the Warrior Priests, Bill Winter.
Hello again.
And I am Donavon Riley. We begin again with The Warrior Ethos by Stephen Pressfield, meditation number 5, The Instinct of Self-Preservation. Some say that self-preservation is the strongest instinct of all, not only in humans, but in all animal life. Fear of death, the imperative to survive. Nature has implanted this in all living creatures. The warrior ethos evolved to counter the instinct of self-preservation. Against this natural impulse to flee from danger, specifically from an armed and organized human enemy, the warrior ethos enlists 3 other equally innate and powerfully human impulses: shame, honor, and love.
Mm-hmm.
And we have discussed shame in the first episode. We discussed honor in the second episode. So because we are completists, we will finish up with love. And thus I will turn now to meditation 13 in the Warrior Ethos by Pressfield. The opposite of fear is love. The greatest counterpoise to fear, the ancients believed, is love. The love of the individual warrior for his brothers in arms. At Thermopylae, on the final morning, when the last surviving Spartans knew they were all going to die, they turned to one of their leaders, the warrior Dionysus, and asked him what thoughts they should hold in their minds in this final hour to keep their courage strong. Dionysus instructed his comrades to fight, not in the name of such lofty concepts as patriotism, honor, duty, or glory. Don't even fight, he said, to protect your family or your home. Fight for this alone. The man who stands at your shoulder, he is everything, and everything is contained within him. The soldier's prayer today on the eve of battle remains not, Lord, spare me, but, Lord, let me not prove unworthy of my brothers. Civilians wonder at the passion displayed by wounded soldiers to get back to their units, to return to the fight. But soldiers understand. It is no marvel to them that men who have lost arms and legs still consider themselves fit for battle. So powerful is the passion to return to their brothers and not to let them down. All warrior cultures train their youths to feel this love. They make the young men on the passage to warriorhood dress alike, eat and sleep alike, speak alike, wear their hair alike, suffer alike, and achieve victory alike. Ordeals of initiation are undergone not as individuals, but as teams, as units. Courage is inseparable from love and leads to what may arguably be the noblest of all warrior virtues, selflessness. And again, that is meditation 13 in the Warrior Ethos. The opposite of fear is love.
Well, and the first question we got to ask then is, what kind of love are we speaking about here? Because it gets kind of squishy when we use the English word.
It does, much like other English words. It's rather squishy, as you said, rather spongy. Should we go with the Greek?
Indeed.
All right. So we have...
Which one, though?
Right. So in the Greek, for those of you who don't know, especially ancient Greek, around the turn, let's say, the early 4th centuries BC, all the way through the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, you had different kinds of love, depending on whether you're reading the philosophers or you're actually reading the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And the first kind of love, eros, erotic love, passionate, lusty love, sexual intimacy, that kind of love. Then you had filial love, philia, the brotherly love, thus Philadelphia, city of brotherly love.
Mhm.
So familial love, intimacy in the way of a family is intimate with one another, loves one another. And then finally you had agape, which is selfless, self-giving love, love without measure or limit, which obviously, for those of you listening to what I just read, that's exactly the word that Pressfield uses, that the greatest, the noblest of all warrior virtues is selflessness, which he attaches to the word love.
Which is agape.
Which is
that
agape,
type of love.
selfless love. Which would you say then, because he uses the example of the soldier's prayer, Lord, let me not prove unworthy of my brothers, that at a certain point, obviously the term brothers is used, philia, brotherly love, that brotherly familial love is transcended or surpassed by selfless love, self-giving love, agape.
Yeah, I think there might be kind of three ways to think about this. At the bottom of the pyramid, as it were, we have eros, that erotic or lustful love. You know, love at first sight would be eros. The next step up on that pyramid, we might have filial love, that love for brothers or sisters, mother, father, etc. And then at the top of that, we have agape. All of these end up making this upward movement toward agape. They're all, in a way, kind of dimly reflecting agape or pointing to agape as the ultimate fulfillment of what that is, what that means. It's one thing to say, well, I love my wife. It's another thing to say, I love my wife to the point that if somebody was attempting to harm her, I would take a bullet for her.
Right, exactly.
Huge difference between the two. And this comes back to the discussion we read at the beginning of each of these episodes, self-preservation. Self-preservation and that instinct for it can still exist beside filial love and eros love.
Right.
It cannot exist in agape love because there's a selflessness there.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking about this last night on the drive home, and I was driving home from class, and I'm going to be competing twice, fighting twice in July and August coming up here.
Nice.
And unfortunately, all the weight that I have spent the last 4 months putting on to gain mass so that when I grapple, I actually have some force or mass behind the push. I now have to lose almost all of it so I can get down to weight, because my body frame is such that I'm at 185 right now. And if you looked at me at 6'2", 6'3", 185, I don't look 185. Like, I can be 170 and 185 and look exactly the same to the outward observer. Therefore, for me to go up a weight class and compete against the 180 to 195 weight class is just asking to be beaten up and violently violated by the opponents. And one of our tournaments is going to be an in-house tournament, and so I know who I'll be competing against if I stay at 185 versus 170. And I just said to my instructor, I'm 100% going down to 170 for this. 100%. I'd rather be long and fast than big and massy in a group of giants. Actually, one of the guys, one of my favorite training partners, we call him Man-Child because he's only 19, but he's 6'4", 210. And he's a mutant.
Big boy.
Yeah, he's a mutant. And but I was driving home reflecting on this, that because I was talking with another teammate of mine that I'll be competing against. In the academy, in that setting, we always refer to one another as teammates or brothers. And it's definitely something that I was aware of, conscious of when I walked in for my first class in jiu-jitsu, having watched competitions and videos and heard that thrown around. And I hadn't really heard that used as intimately and as authentically really anywhere else before. And so I wanted that too, for various reasons due to my upbringing and so forth. And so we've talked about that merit-based system. What you put in is what you get out of it. And it's also a filter then for those who are there for only themselves. I'm just here to get something for myself, to prove something to myself. It's primarily an ego-driven pursuit. And those are the types of people, for example, who, when they spar, let's say in Muay Thai, the difference between sparring at 20% and 60% and 90% is all the same speed and all the same power. And they're dangerous because they don't train down or up or with you. They just train to prove something to themselves. They're also the types of people who rarely show up to practice technique or warm up. They only show up to spar. And yet outside of that then is this brotherhood, this sisterhood, where, as I've said in other places, when you roll with somebody, when you spar with somebody, you probably, by the time you're done, you will know everything you need to know about that person's character and personality, everything, because you can't hide on the mats, as we say. And so I know there are people that I know intimately from training with them. I don't even know what they do for a job. I couldn't tell you where they lived. I don't have their number in my phone, but if I was in Texas in jail and I had to call somebody to come bail me out, I would call somebody I train with, because I know people that I train with who would get in a car in the middle of the night, drive to Texas and bail me out, sight unseen. My own family wouldn't do that, which is a whole nother narrative. But the point being then, driving home last night, thinking about the competition and whatnot, a big part of jumping into a competition, being the oldest person in the in-house tournament by quite a bit, at least a decade. One, it is that brotherhood. It is that filial relationship that I have with these people, that I want to show up for them. I want to be a part of that pursuit, a part of that struggle along with them. But then, yes, at a certain point, the whole reason that I push myself and push myself for my teammates and do enter into competitions and to grow as a person and so forth, is because I always want to be prepared to defend my wife and my children, or people in my congregation, or my neighbor, whoever it might be. And so, like you were discussed or described, on the one hand, it's filial love that drives me to do these things with my teammates, for myself, that we benefit from one another, as we talked about in the first episode. The welfare of my training partner is my welfare. But then it transcends that at I think the root of motivation, that the ultimate motivation is not necessarily, I love my family, or I love my brothers and sisters I train with, and therefore I'll fight for them. But rather, no, I'm going to fight because there's still something I have to prove to myself. There's still barriers that I want to push past, as far as, let's say, ego, insecurity, fear, these types of things. But ultimately, it is so that you can stand there on the street, if necessary, with your wife and children, and say to the person who's coming at you, you're not going to do this because I'll sacrifice my life for these people. Are you willing? And that, that came to the conclusion about a year or so ago, listening to someone say, if my child died, I'd just die if one of my children were taken from me. And I thought, would you though? Because I've buried a lot of kids. And their parents are still coming to church. I still talk to their parents. They're still living their life.
Yep.
And so and just the moment, I kind of threw it out there without really thinking. That's fine, but would you kill for them? The person that said it was taken aback and kind of stunned that I would suggest that. And I said, that's really much more difficult. Dying is passive. Laying down and giving up, jumping in front of a car, that's easy. That takes a moment. To get up every day, put your feet on the floor and say, today I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight to be a better husband. I'm going to fight to be a better father. I'm going to fight to be a better neighbor, and whatever it might be, teammate. The reason you do that is because you've chosen to sacrifice your own wants and needs, your own cravings, for the other person and what they need from you.
No, that's good. And I think in some ways, from a human perspective, agape is only possible in certain circumstances.
Would you say it has to be a spontaneous act?
To
be selfless?
I think so. I know for myself, planning selflessness, if you will, is impossible.
Well, it's selfish, right?
Yeah, if I dig deep enough, I'm going to find something for me in there. I think that's fair to say that there has to be a spontaneousness to it.
And maybe that's the purpose of training, is to prepare yourself to always be ready in the moment, not to think about what necessarily needs to be done, because that hesitation will cost you. It's destructive. But that the muscle memory is there and you simply react.
Yeah. That's the purpose of military training.
Right.
Everyone blanks the first time live rounds are being fired. So what you need is that muscle memory that will instantly kick in, because your mind's going to go blank for a bit there. You're
I can't imagine
look around. Well, you look around and everyone has the same stupid look that you have on your face, which is just kind of big-eyed, like, oh no, those tracers aren't NATO colors. Uh-oh. And they're going the wrong way. And that's good. That's good. Muscle memory is a good thing. I think even beyond the military or martial arts, things of that nature, muscle memory is a good thing. Muscle memory is the reason that you can have a decent conversation with your kid while you're doing the dishes, driving, any of these tasks that have become automatic. You don't have to think about them as you did, when you were 15 and had your permit. It's automatic action. That's
a good point too, though, of when you're young, because I did a lot of illegal and stupid things as a teenager. And a primary, as any parent knows, as anyone who reflects on their own stupidity when they were going through puberty, you do so much because you don't have an experience base to work from, and you don't then have the emotional maturity to detach and observe reality rather than just throw your perception of reality at the moment. And as I was saying to a friend I had coffee with yesterday, he's 19 years old. He's now gotten to that age where he's finally starting to recognize his mortality. He's not invincible, not invulnerable. He's not bulletproof, and he's not that intelligent. And if you think about simply, let's say, the history of agrarian culture, your life is a blink, less than a blink.
Oh, yeah.
It's like one person said, we're like the fly on the back of a cow as observed by a car going by on the highway at 80 miles an hour. That's our life. And that can be crushing for folks, especially young people, to realize, as Hamlet says, what is this quintessence of dust? We're just dust particles in relation to infinity. And that can be overwhelming, I think, for a lot of people. And the reason I bring it up, though, is teenagers exist in the moment. This is why Romeo and Juliet makes so much sense to a college senior or a high school senior.
Right.
But to an adult who's married with kids, we're like, idiots.
Yeah, right.
Yet if we reflect, that's really what happens then to us as adults in this situation of selflessness, is we are caught up in a situation, as you noted, that is unreality, but it is reality. To our perception of reality, this doesn't make any sense. There's red things coming out of the darkness at me, but our tracers are green. So how does that work? And they're going the wrong direction, as you noted. Or the first time, like last night, teaching the intro to jiu-jitsu class, we had a young teenage girl coming in because she's being bullied at school. Teaching her, the first time I went into half guard with her and clamped my thighs around her thigh, her eyes just got big as saucers. Because she just looked at me and started to giggle uncomfortably, because obviously she's never been grabbed with a person's legs like that before. And it's so unreal to her what's happening that she can't grasp that this is reality. This is what we do here. And this is now your reality. Her perception won't allow her to grasp the reality of the situation. And yet I wonder then, to your point, that spontaneity occurs in those moments when, like I said, when a person comes up to you in the street and gets in your face and starts threatening you. That's not normal for most people.
Yep.
Therefore, your brain does not comprehend fully what's happening in that moment. And if you're not trained in violence, if you're not trained to breathe and stay relaxed in conflict, your brain simply says, this is not happening. That's the fight, flight, or freeze response. And most people freeze.
Yeah, precisely.
And you can, and you know this as well as I do, and those who are listening, we all have friends or family who talk a good game about what they would do in a situation. Those are usually people that own lots of knives and guns and, and blow lots of stuff up on the 4th of July and watch the UFC and armchair quarterback the UFC fighters, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And yet when any kind of stress or pressure is applied to their person, they fold up. And I was taught this very early on by a guy I knew named Tommy, who said to me, I think I was about 19, he said, if the guy coming at you is talking to you about how he's going to kick your butt and whatnot, he's not going to kick your butt. If a guy starts walking toward you and he doesn't say anything, run. Because he's going to kick the crap out of you.
Yeah. Very potentially. And it's the same. It's not just, when bullets are flying, it's the first time you ever get into a fist fight.
Absolutely.
You watch people in bars just throwing haymakers at each other. They're not able to think. Knew a guy growing up who, a very huge kid and, kind of a gentle giant type, but had grown up. His dad was a Golden Gloves boxer. Taught his boy how to box from, however young he was. The danger with that kid was that he could think, and you could see it, when he'd get into a row with somebody.
Sure.
You could see he's processing information while the other's not. And he would end up beating the snot out of people because of that reason. And to kind of pull it back then, tying it into our first and second episode when we're talking about virtue, this is the same thing is required for the building of virtue as training is required for the building of a soldier or Marine. What you're building is muscle memory. So when we're talking about the virtue of honesty, for example, you're attempting to develop the muscle memory so that it's automatic that you tell the truth.
I just talked to my 8-year-old about this the other night.
Yeah. I've heard it described as the building of habit, these things. But this is correct. And that's essentially what you're doing.
Right.
Is you are attempting to build the habit of virtue. You're attempting to build the habit of proper response to a crisis situation, whatever that may be.
And I think that's the difficulty, to your point, is building a good habit. Living virtuously is difficult, and it's a challenge. It requires struggle. It requires sacrifice. Vice is easy. It's the downhill slope. It's the death drive, as Ernest Becker called it, the path of least resistance in Freudian analysis. That to lie and develop that habit of lying pathologically, that's easy. Telling the truth and then taking responsibility for the consequences, that's difficult because you're not necessarily going to like the consequences of telling the truth, especially if you were going to be honest. And I'm reading The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. And in the section on action, and the book is divided into 3 sections: perception, action, and will, or willpower. And in the section on action, there's a meditation about what is the meaning of life in terms of the Stoics, for example, Seneca or Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus. And the meaning of life for the Stoics is try hard, be honest, help others and yourself. But it's action, that the purpose of life is action. It is movement. And as the title of the book points out, going around the obstacle is not the way to the goal, but rather the obstacle is the way to the goal. And this is a point that we constantly come back to in the combat martial arts, is that the struggle and the training and the drilling of the technique and the sparring and the competing are obstacles. Obstacles to your ego thriving, obstacles to developing bad, unhealthy habits, And as a consequence, if you stick with it, if you struggle and allow yourself to embrace the challenge and sacrifice your physical health, your mental health, your emotional health, allow yourself to be crushed and then get up and do it again, you get stronger because you're developing that habit. And at a certain point, you can be a hobbyist. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's a certain then group who will go beyond that hobbyist mentality and become obsessed. And then they change the way that they eat. They change the way that they sleep. They change everything about their life as a consequence of jiu-jitsu, for example, and then to contribute to jiu-jitsu. It's kind of circular. But within that then is the relationships then in your life improve because you try harder to be a good friend, a good boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, coworker, fellow student, training partner. Your habits change and you actually care about being a good person. And whether you're aware of it or not, you develop those habits through that struggle and those challenges with other people, by the way, like we talked about. You can't be selfless in a vacuum. You have to have someone to your left and someone to your right that you're willing to fall for, or step in front of the bullet for, or simply sacrifice your time for. And if you're not, then get out of line because you're a danger to everybody at that point. And whether it's in the family, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in the gym, whether it's on the front lines, if you're not capable of that sacrifice or willing to make that sacrifice, also understand that it is a mark of integrity and character to simply say, I'm not capable of doing this. I'm not willing to do this. That in and of itself is selfless because, again, you're overriding your own ego, which wants you to justify your decisions to yourself so that you come out looking good, being the righteous one. And you sublimate that and say, I can't do this. I can't commit myself to this. And there is integrity in that, I do believe. And that's why, like going back to Pressfield, patriotism, honor, duty, glory, those are all nice words. And they look great on bumper stickers and at political rallies. But you don't fight for patriotism, honor, duty, or glory. You don't even fight to protect your family or your home. You're fighting for the man who stands at your shoulder. He is everything. And everything that you want and need is contained within him. Because again, selfless, self-giving love recognizes, agape recognizes, my well-being is the well-being of the person to my left and to my right. And their well-being is my well-being. It's one and the same. Now, to shift gears just a little bit to lead us into Cyrus the Great, something I wanted to discuss with you about is currently in the year of our Lord, 2019, July or almost July, this attitude, as I referred to with the difficulty of living virtuously versus living a vice-ridden life, you don't find a lot of selflessness in our culture. In fact, I would argue selflessness is actually looked down upon as a vice by the broader culture.
Oh, yeah. Well, selflessness requires that I give up what I want for the sake of the neighbor. Mm-hmm. And presently, there is so much that we all want. Who the heck are you to tell me that I have to give up this or that for, say, the sake of the nation as a whole, or even, my town, whatever. That's a foreign concept to us.
Well, I wonder too, because the way that I grew up, as I say, I didn't enjoy childhood so much as I survived childhood and then escaped from my home eventually. I grew up being raised by two very selfish people. And as I also say, my family's moral compass was a weather vane. And so whichever way the wind blew, that was our morals. But at root, our morality as a family was, we're right, they're wrong. So growing up, that kind of selfishness, me first attitude was inculcated. So when I got out on my own, I just looked at everybody as an opportunity to get something for myself. Every job, every relationship, it was all about me and what I got from it, what I deserved, what I was entitled to. And I was abused, so I deserve this. And my dad's an alcoholic and a drug addict, so I deserve this. And, regardless of the fact that, as I've said before, when you go through recovery and recognize that dad wasn't there forcing you to drink when you were 24 years old, so stop blaming him for your problems. there's a blow to the ego where you have to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, you are responsible for all of the destructive stuff that's occurring in your life, and the failed relationships, and the girlfriends hunting for you, and the drug dealers who want their money, and so forth. It's hard to accept that when you have been especially raised in an ecosystem of selfishness. And of course, there's plenty of selfish people that contribute to your habit, your selfish habit. And they're more than willing to forgive you your selfishness, so long as you forgive their selfishness. Thus, there's also, I think, at least the way I looked at it, was anybody who was selfless was a wimp, was spineless, was weak. And how can you let how can you let anybody just walk all over you like that? Like, don't you understand that that's a sign of weakness? And this is actually something that was really difficult when Annie and I first got married. Was she was such a giving person, and I'm such a taking person, that I was attracted to her primarily because she's a giving person and I'm a taker, and I need someone to give because I'm a taker. But I also resented her then for being so weak, because I was raised to believe that people that give and give and give are weak, and they don't deserve your respect, and they don't deserve your attention. They're just there to be used and thrown aside. So that was really a challenge for us early in our marriage. Was she had to figure out how to be a taker, and I had to figure out how to be a giver. And after about 11 years, we got pretty good at it. So the first 11 were rough, and then the second 11 were pretty good. But even she'll be the first to say that as hard as I worked at it, and as many different avenues as I investigated to try and be more giving and selfless, it really wasn't until I started jiu-jitsu and Muay Thai that it actually took root. Like, it actually bit and got traction. Because again, it was talking about humility, talking about love, talking about brotherhood, talk. But then when it was done to me by another person, shown to me, manifested in another person, as Pressfield points out, everything is contained within the person who stands at your shoulder. Then I understood what I had been missing all those years of searching, which was, you can't do this in a vacuum. You got to have you have to have an object that you are willing to sacrifice yourself for.
And that object needs to be a person.
It does. It can't be a flag. It can't be a building. It can't be a group. It has to be a person. I should say, it can't be a group in an institutional abstract sense.
Yeah.
A group in an actual interpersonal sense, like, let's say, AA or a book club, or you name it, where you're sitting around a table, let's say, and you're face to face with people. That, yeah, absolutely. Because it goes back to what we discussed about shame-based culture too, though, of shame in a positive way is, I don't want to let them down. Like, the worst thing that I could do is let them down. That being said, then let's transition into Xenophon, Cyrus the Great. As with this book, there's so many examples of everything that we talk about. We're going to jump to book 12. And this is basically the story about Panthea and her husband. So beginning on page 186 of Cyrus the Great, which is edited by Larry Hedrick, if you're looking for the book, To Change the World, I decided to send a spy into Lydia to follow the movements of the Assyrian brute and his rich ally Croesus, or Crasus. And I considered my Median kinsman Raspis the right man for the job. Recently, Raspis's name had fallen into disrepute, for he had been overwhelmed by his love for a lady from Susa named Panthea, the supremely beautiful wife of a warrior allied with the Assyrian king. We had captured her earlier in the campaign, at a time when her valiant husband, Abydos, was away on a diplomatic mission. Raspis had gone half mad, trying to make Panthea love him in return, but her loyalty to her husband never wavered, not for an instant. According to the lady herself, when she kept refusing his advances, Raspis had threatened her with violence. When her accusation became known in the ranks, the men branded Raspis a villain. I shared in the blame for this situation, for it was I who had thought Raspis a good choice to be the lady's protector. When it came time for me to intervene directly with Raspis, I sent for him and welcomed him without censure, for his features were already twisted by his sense of shame. Take comfort, I told him. Wiser men than you have made themselves fools for love. I myself, Raspis broke in with these words, "Oh, Cyrus, you are always patient with human failings. But the rest of the army has rejected me like a rabid dog. As soon as the troops got wind of my weakness for this lovely woman, everyone who dislikes me was pleased. And even my friends said I should kill myself, since I betrayed my ties of blood to you by creating such a scandal." Thus demonstrating that the Persians may have been a little bit more serious about such matters as than we are in the present.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh, that's good stuff, though. What you have here, then, is this woman, Panthea, supremely beautiful wife of a warrior who currently fights for the Assyrian king. And they've captured her. Abydos is the warrior's name. And yet notice he has gone half mad trying to make Panthea love him in return, but her loyalty to her husband never wavered, even when she was threatened with violence. I assume what he's saying is, I'm going to basically force you to accept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because that's the way this is going to be. I love you, and I'm going to force you to love me back.
Yeah. Club her over the head, drag her back to your cave style.
Which, to the point, and I think it is a good distinction here, selfless love, agape love, is just that. You give away yourself to the other. Mm-hmm. Selfish love, that is, you choose to love someone who does not love you in return, is rape. That's literally the definition. Yeah. So if you wondered what selfish love looks like, especially when pushed or forced upon a person who doesn't reciprocate, that's rape. Thus, what happens, though, notice, this goes to the point of honor. His enemies say, see, told you, he's not a good guy. He shouldn't be in Cyrus's confidence. He shouldn't be a friend of Cyrus. And even his own friends say, you should probably just commit suicide. You've dishonored yourself by, and this is the key here, you broke your tie of blood to Cyrus, right? We just don't do that anymore.
No, not at all.
For me personally, obviously we're reading this. I love this stuff. This is inspiring. Because I think that's what I was looking for all the years of wandering around looking for answers myself, is I just wanted to find some people who wanted to live intensely. They wanted to live authentically, purposefully, intensely. Mm-hmm. And not accept the status quo, not accept that life is just static and the this is the way it is kind of attitude. But people that were ready to accept the next challenge, the people that were ready to enter into the struggle with myself or me with them, welcome me into that struggle, give me that sense of place and belonging, give that meaning to your life of action for the sake of action is worthless. Just go drive around on the highway. Everybody's in a hurry to get nowhere most days. But action for the purpose of this is the goal. This is what we're striving for. And to then the esprit de corps, you have Raspis saying, you have to love me. I'm going to force you to love me if you don't love me. Mm-hmm. These folks within the ethic of their culture are saying that is the most dishonorable thing that you could possibly do.
Yeah. Well, they're recognizing it for what we talked about earlier, and that being Eros.
Yeah. Yes, right.
Eros is worthless.
Right. Well, even a dog can populate and appreciate Eros. And platonically speaking, Plato, to paraphrase, said that without laws, men are essentially they'll become wild beasts. And this goes to the point, too, for the Persians, is that Raspis's behavior lowers him in their estimation, in their perception of him. He's not a warrior anymore, but rather he's a dog.
Well, and the distinction then, and I think it's helpful to contrast that with our view of things today, is that in many, many, many ancient cultures, the difference, philosophically speaking, between a human and an animal was that the human had the ability to resist and to hone and to channel their instincts in constructive ways. Whereas the animal, animals are creatures of passion. They're creatures of instinct. That's how they operate. The human ought not be so. And that is the difference. And I think there's something to be said for viewing the difference in that way. Yeah, there are many differences between the human and the animal that we recognize today. DNA, for example. But I think in all these extra differences we've discovered, which are helpful, man is not a featherless chicken, to riff off the philosopher you were just talking about. Mm-hmm. These differences we recognize today are helpful. However, in learning these, we have lost that old definition.
Yes.
A human being is different from the animals in its ability to control its passions, its instincts.
I was going to say, especially due to the Industrial Revolution, the mechanical animal, a principle floated by several Enlightenment thinkers like Hobbes. I think Hume might have done it too. But it's that we're basically machines, we're mechanisms, we're mechanical animals. And yeah, you can say Darwin's evolution of the species and so forth contributed to this in his own way, sure. But I think this goes to the deeper point too of when we were talking about starting this podcast, one of the things I noted to you was we don't even have metaphysical conversations anymore, broadly speaking. It's all about the mechanics of living, like people living mechanically, which I think, and I'm not referring to that in the sense of that muscle memory that we were referring to earlier, but rather they're living mechanically, they're robotic. I get up and I do this, and then I do this, and then I do that. It's not a habit. It's not discipline, by the way. Discipline is purposeful. And it is, as you said, it's controlled. It's a decision. I decide to get up at 4:30. I decide to have my mushroom coffee. I decide to have my bulletproof coffee. I decide to read this book, all for the purpose of disciplining my mind, my body, and my emotions. It's purposeful. It's not mechanical. It's not mindless. I'm not just doing it in the same way. I think, again, going back to the holiday book, a deer, for example, is continuously in the moment and there's no real separation between thought and action for a deer. But that's also why deer run out in front of cars.
Yeah. Yep.
When they're startled. It's interesting then to go back and read, for example, Plato and Aristotle, especially Aristotle since he was a biology major, biologist, is they were able to embrace the metaphysical as well as the physical simultaneously and hold that dichotomy in tension. Whereas in the present, as I said, you try having a metaphysical conversation with someone about the meaning of life, not God even, just in a general sense of, well, what is love? Where does that come from? What is truth? What is morality? Where does morality come from? Is it, like Marx said, just a social construct? Or who was the ancient Greek philosopher? Was it Diogenes? Lived in a barrel?
Yeah, that was Diogenes. He was the one who took a chicken, shaved it, and plopped it down in front of Plato and said, "Behold, a man."
Right.
Anyway.
Right. But I always hold up Diogenes as an example of he, as well-meaning as his intentions may have been, for him to live in that barrel and be essentially an anarchistic presence in the city, there needed to be men on the wall. He was a
scumbag, ultimately.
Right. When he went out into the middle of the Olympic field and took a dump to prove a point that morality is a social construct, to my point, he beat guys like Nietzsche to the punch and Marx. But for a guy like Nietzsche or Marx needed an Engels to pay the bills, for example.
Right.
A lot of people don't know that, is that Engels was the guy who paid all the bills, for not only for Marx, but for his kids too, until he cut them off, and then they both committed suicide.
Yeah.
So there you go. There's Marxism in a nutshell.
Yeah. Well, the people who ultimately footed the bill are buried in Ukraine and Siberia and elsewhere.
Exactly.
So,
without the conversation, what's the purpose of love in this context? If you can't have the conversation, then the word itself is meaningless.
Yeah.
Ultimately, and it does become, like I said, with my family, whatever meaning you inject into it, that becomes the good or the virtue in it, even if you're a rapist.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, is that you're injecting some meaning to this word love without taking that step back and objectively asking, well, what is love actually?
Mm-hmm.
And like we started with, if you can't differentiate between different forms of love, different expressions of love, and you just lump them all into one big ball, especially in the 20th and 21st century, in this psychoanalytical love is a sentimental kind of love, which is actually a song, Sentimental Kind of Love. This is the problem, I think, is that we become mechanical in what we do.
Well, and mechanical in the sense that none of us are going to pass the Turing test if we're all living that way.
Right.
None of us are human at that point. So when we're talking about love, what most people are going to imagine is that squishy feeling.
Yeah.
Or that squishy feeling plus a knowledge that this squishy feeling is coming from a combination of chemicals and synapses in my brain firing in a particular fashion.
Right.
And that's all well and good.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the difference between a mechanic knowing how an engine operates and a driver knowing that it's not okay to run children over.
Right.
You know, and so what we end up doing is just weaponizing things for our own benefit.
Mm-hmm.
We end up saying, well, to point to this example from Xenophon, dude loves this chick, loves in the eros sense.
Right.
Ergo, she must be mine. Well, she's already married. That's a problem.
Right.
And attempting to force her, you know, regardless of her marital status,
right,
that's another problem.
And but notice too.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, notice too, Cyrus honors his enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Her husband is a warrior for the enemy, and yet Cyrus still honors his enemy.
Well, I mean, to be frank, given the character of Cyrus that Xenophon paints for us here, he'd have probably had that dude executed if he'd have just forced his hand with her.
Yeah,
I seriously doubt there would have been any compassion at that point. But we end up doing this with a number of concepts, love included. We'll inject a nuance or a meaning into it that benefits us.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's we can all agree stealing is wrong, right?
Of
course.
So. I hope so.
Well, yeah, we all hope so. But what about hedge fund management? Now we're in a so-called gray area. Well, that's not stealing. That's just gambling with other people's money. And on and on and on these examples go. But that's what we end up doing. We'll take a concept that ought to be understood not just in a mechanical, a physical, way, and inject meaning into it until the original object is so out of shape that we can fit it into whatever hole we need to fit the peg into.
Right.
And ultimately, when we're doing that, you got to step back and say, okay, well, what am I getting out of this? Oh, I'm actually stealing, or whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
But because of this, what would you call it? Metaphysical ignorance? I'm not sure if there's a proper phrase for it. Right. Because of the fact that we have lost the vocabulary and the ability to have these conversations, myself included, we live like brutes until life hits you hard enough, or in my case, enough times.
Right.
And then you move on to the next thing. And then you learn from that only after getting beaten down enough. And we just have this movement from issue to issue to issue, and the root of it is all the same. We've never actually learned, for example, what love is. Mm-hmm. So we substitute that word for eros, for example, or greed, or whatever the case may be. And then eventually, through time and circumstances, some of us end up lucky enough to be confronted with, Aurelius, for example, or Aristotle, whomever. And it opens up this whole world that previously never existed. And you start going, oh, wow, that thing that he warned about, 2,500 years ago, I was doing that for 10 years. Oh, crap.
Well, and that's why it's easier, I think, to continue on in those bad habits, because that's exactly the point, is that one day you're confronted with, well, that was a lot of time and energy, and I put a lot of effort into not growing as a person, or going the wrong direction, or investing in the wrong stock, working at the wrong job, being with the wrong person. My mom at 21 knew that she should have divorced my dad, but stayed with him because she was pregnant with me, and thought, well, once the baby's born, everything will change. And it didn't. And there was simply the constant thought then, well, I'll stay until this happens, and I'll stay until that happens, and eventually things will change, and eventually things will change. Yeah. Which is essentially accepting the status quo, but lying to yourself about the truth, about objective reality. Yeah. And so the perception is things will eventually get better, until they didn't. And then when the kids were out of the house and there was no other distractions, no other obstacles, then they got divorced.
Well, and loyalty as a concept will end up hitting.
Yeah, for sure.
But there is a line between loyalty and, shall we say, suicide.
Right.
Anyway, that's a conversation for another day.
Right. So well, let's jump forward then to page 190 to continue the story of Panthea and Amadis. So as soon as Panthea heard the rumor that Raspis had run away, this is all a part of this scheme that Cyrus concocted to send a spy into the Assyrian camp.
Who is Raspis?
Raspis, the perfect opportunity, because he had been shamed and dishonored because of his love for Panthea, his lust, his cravings. And so Cyrus used that then as an opportunity. So that's why Raspis, to everyone in the Persian camp, ran away because of his shame and his villainy at his wanting Panthea for himself. So Panthea hears this, and she sends a messenger to Cyrus saying, "Prince Cyrus, please do not be tempted to grieve over Raspis. I will bring you a far better friend than your untrustworthy cousin, if you let me send for my husband, Amadis of Susa. I am certain that he will come to us with all the power at his command. It is true that the old king of Assyria was my husband's friend, but the new king tried to take me away from Amadis, and my husband deeply resents his tyranny." I'm sorry, I was pronouncing it Abadis, and now I'm pronouncing it Abadis. It's the fact that it's 20 years of Greek.
Right.
I jump back and forth. I apologize to the listener who's saying, well, who's Abadis? I thought his name was Abadis. Abadis. In America, Abadis. If you tutored and taught Greek, it's Abadis, not Abadite. So, I'm sorry, Abadis. There we go. Would gladly join forces with such a man as you. I gave Panthea permission to contact your husband. When Abadis read the letter from his wife, he set out for my camp at once with 1,000 horsemen in his train. When he came to the Persian outposts, he asked to see me. Instead, I gave orders that Abadis should be taken to Panthea immediately. So husband and wife, whose chances for a reunion had long seemed dim, were in each other's arms again. When she spoke of the sympathy that I had shown her, Abadis exclaimed, "Tell me how I can repay Cyrus for his great deed." She answered, "My dear husband, all you really need to do is treat him as he has treated you." Abadis came to my tent, and taking me by my hand, said, "Cyrus, in return for the kindness you have shown me and Panthea, I will be your friend, your servant, and your ally. Tell me what you require of me, and I will do it." "I'm very happy to accept your allegiance, Abadis," I said. "But for the moment, I only want you to be with your wife. During all those weeks without you, she was in a constant state of desperation. So for now, you must stay by her side." Since men always long to be ordered to obey their own hearts, Abadis thanked me and hurried back to Panthea. A few days later, When he saw how much attention I was paying to the scythe-bearing chariots, he vowed to equip 100 chariots for me out of his cavalry. He actually outdid me, offering to lead this new force in a 4-pulled chariot drawn by 8 horses with chest plates of bronze. And so it goes. So there you have it. There's honor on display. Cyrus behaves with honor, and thus Abidice, being a man of honor, being a warrior,
repays him in kind.
Mm-hmm. And thus Cyrus not only gains an ally, but he gains 100 chariots.
Well, and he also solves his Raspus problem.
He really does.
Raspus comes back and tries that with Galligan. Probably going to get his butt kicked.
Right. Funny how that works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some things don't change.
But I think, too, this is what is unique about Cyrus is his, much like Marcus Aurelius, here is a man who is grown up in privilege and wealth, who is the son of a king, who has never wanted for anything in his life, and yet Cyrus is obsessed, like Marcus Aurelius, with matters of self-control, self-discipline, being a selfless person. What does it mean to be a good man? And so he manifests these in his life. And if you read the whole book, he does have his moments where he fails and has to walk it back and repent. And yet, in those moments, he does recognize, okay, as you said about, I've been doing this 10 years and I just now learned that I was going the wrong direction. Cyrus, it pains him when it comes up that I was wrong. I disrespected you. I behaved inappropriately. This is not an honorable way to speak or behave. But then he walks it back. As painful as it is, he walks it back because he recognizes even in those moments, there's something to be learned that will improve him, that will make him a more virtuous person, a more honorable leader, a greater warrior, a leader of warriors as well. And that little passage there of Cyrus saying to Abidice, go to your wife, don't worry about it. And also just the point that what the heart wants, the heart wants.
Mm-hmm.
And as we've been talking about, that can be hyper-destructive, or it can allow a man to sacrifice his life for the sake of the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The harnessing of instinctual impulses, the harnessing of these various things is what separates us from the animals.
Right.
And can be a very positive force. Raspus, despite feeling these feelings and thinking these thoughts, ought to have harnessed these things, ought to have restrained them. And it's always easy to armchair quarterback, but the fact remains he shows up in this situation for us as an example.
Mm-hmm. Well, it goes to your earlier point, too, that human beings are the only creature that can step outside of ourselves and reflect on ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that self-reflection is lacking in Raspus. He's not able to take a step back and just observe himself and ask, what is this man doing and what is the end goal? And I crave her. Great. Do you crave her in the way that you crave meat? In the way that you crave peace? In the way that you crave a good drink at the end of the day? Is that really all she is to you? Is a glass of wine or a hot steak or a quiet night by the fire? Is that all she is to you? Because that's not love. Yeah, it's actually, let's just jump right to the conclusion too of this on page 225, because it really is a nice juxtaposition of Croesus or Crasus, depending again on whether you're American or not, the king of Lydia, and Abidice. So this is page 225 now. I found his entire performance disingenuous, but Crasus nevertheless continued in the same vein. Now, Crasus has been conquered by Cyrus, and he's kind of a toady. He says what he thinks Cyrus wants him to say. He behaves the way that he thinks Cyrus would want him to behave, so that essentially he can stay on the throne. And so he says to Cyrus, I really never liked the Assyrian king to begin with, and his son's even worse. And I'm really thankful that you're here now. And I'm so glad that you conquered us because I'm 100% on your side. And I've always wanted to be on your side. So that's why Cyrus says his whole performance was disingenuous. It is a performance. But he continued, dramatically seizing me by the arm, Croesus demanded to know if the god would accept him still. Tell me, Cyrus, will Apollo ever bless me again? The fallen king of Lydia, I had to acknowledge, had hit upon a clever method of begging for mercy. Give me time to think, I told him. For the moment, all I can do is promise that you will be reunited with your wife and children. Other than that, only one thing is certain. Your career as a warrior king is over. So much the better, Croesus exclaimed. I'll be content to lead a quiet life and to serve you however I can. This old fox, I thought, will still bear watching. From the farce of Croesus, I was forced to turn to the tragedy of Abydos and Panthea. She recovered her husband's body from the battlefield before it could be consumed by carrion eaters. She then carried his mutilated remains away in her own carriage to the banks of the peaceful river, Pactolus, which flows across the plain below Sardis. And just so you know as a listener, Abydos not only sacrificed himself for Cyrus, but Abydos always fought at the front. He was the tip of the spear of Cyrus's army and charged into the ranks of the enemy without even waiting for everybody else to come alongside of him. And thus he was killed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Again, there's bravery and honor and loyalty, and then there's driving the bus off the cliff.
Mm-hmm.
Again, shout out to Abydos for his bravery and his loyalty to Cyrus. However, you might want to wait for your wingman to show up. Just saying.
Right.
So to continue with the book, while her servants were digging a grave for the dead hero on a small hill, Panthea lay down by the side of his corpse and slit her throat with a scimitar. She died quickly, bleeding out her own life on her husband's shattered chest. When I learned of this calamity, I went to the site to honor the memory of them both. I promised their spirits that I'd raise an elegant monument above their common grave, and then I came away. Yeah. So there you go. You have Croesus on one hand, who Cyrus says, go back to your wife and kids. You're not going to fight anymore. And Croesus says, great, I want nothing more. And yet all Croesus thinks about is saving his own skin.
Yep.
Abydos sacrifices his own life in service to Cyrus against his former ally. Mm-hmm. And then Panthea slits her own throat so that she can die with her husband because she'd rather die than live without him. Which I alluded to in the first episode talking about tribal society and tribal ethics.
Yeah.
Which in tribal societies, the only reason to kill yourself, there's only three. One is you betray your village to the enemy. You're captured in war, let's say, and you betray your village. Two is if you become a burden on the village because your husband dies or you're too old to hunt or gather or fish or take care of the hut. And betrayal. So betrayal is one reason where you can kill yourself. Being a burden on the village is another reason. And then I think that's it. There's the third one. I can't remember off the top of my head. But the point being is that in a tribal society, it's not about you. Mm-hmm. It's not about you're hopeless, and so you decide to end it all. But rather, you're putting the whole community in a hopeless situation. You're a burden on the community. And as a consequence, that was accepted. It was acceptable to go off into the woods and die of exposure or whatever it might be. But otherwise, it's unheard of in tribal societies. Suicide, for example, and depression, by the way. Below 1% in most tribal areas, most tribal societies. And so here then, with Panthea, in a similar ethic, not binary, but similarly, if he's dead, why would I want to keep living? And we see that in the first excerpt. She's willing to suffer the violence of Raspus, whatever that may be, even if it means that he ends up killing her. So she already has demonstrated her love for her husband. Mm-hmm. And here she simply caps it by saying, yeah, if he's dead, I want to die next to him. Which my wife, I don't think could be convinced to do. But again, spontaneously, in a pinch, if she wasn't paying attention, absolutely.
Well, and it'd be helpful then to contrast this idea. In a tribal society, these types of things are necessary for the continuation of the tribe, as it were. In a nation or a society that we have now, for all the bad, there is something to be said for the fact that at least we used to look down on the idea of so-called burdening others, because now the example of the person too old to, dare I say, be of any use,
right,
now provides those who take care of him, especially children, grandchildren, etc., with the opportunity to then take care of him.
The third one is if you are crippled or disabled. That is, again, you're not elderly, but you're unable to contribute to the overall welfare of the community. So to your point too, think of all the vets that come back without arms and legs.
Yep.
In a traditional tribal society, we would kill those people because they would threaten the well-being of the village.
Yep. Well, and that would be one advantage of having grown beyond the limits of a tribal society. Now the society as a whole has the opportunity to serve them.
Right.
Which is a good thing. One of the most ridiculous things I see today is people who have children or grandchildren, sometimes in some cases even spouses, capable of taking care of them, whether it's physically or paying a at-home nurse, things like this, and yet the temptation is to dump them, off in a nursing home, wherever.
I'm a pastor. I see this all the time.
Oh, well, yeah, I was going to say, you see this all the time on visitation. The problem is that when we're talking about the development of virtue, by doing that, not only are you not developing virtue, but you are aiding in the growing vices of our society.
Exactly. It's
that
like
being
termites
one of
that eat away at the foundation of a house.
Yeah. So, it's easy to think to yourself, well, it's just one old guy. And yet the reality of it is that every just one old guy is another straw, as it were, on the camel's back of this issue. And the collapse of societies is a real issue, and it does happen, and it can and will happen to us.
Right.
Why contribute to that?
Well, that goes to the whole question again of the metaphysical question of the greater meaning of life and whatnot. And likewise, to quote a famous saying, because I was talking about Recover earlier, in Recover we say 1 drink is too many and 100's not enough. Yeah. I see a similar ethic in driving up to the curb, dropping your mom or dad off at the retirement home and driving away and saying, don't worry, the check will show up every month to pay the bill. How many of those individuals is too many? 1. Because when you do it once, the temptation is to do it 100 times in every other aspect of your life. It's like a spouse who fools around. Yep. Is 1 affair too many? I would argue yes. And yet once you commit 1 affair, what's to stop you from having more than 1 affair? And going off and being the eternal playboy who plays the domesticated husband or wife during the day. But without the underlying question, the subtextual question of what is the purpose of love? What is the goal of love? Yeah. The sacrifice yourself for the beloved. What is the purpose of honor? What is the purpose of having people in your life? What is the purpose of your relationships? What is the purpose of self-improvement and personal growth? What's the point? Because at root, those are selfish questions. They're selfish pursuits, and yet they're selfish pursuits in search of a selfless outcome, which is kind of an internal contradiction, and yet that's kind of the way it works.
Yeah. Well, there's a double benefit. You better yourself, and you obviously get better because of it.
Right.
But at the same time, you better those around you. The person who, I don't know, is trying to get in better shape will be better at their job as a result.
Right.
Even if it's just sitting at a desk. And we could take those examples on really forever. When we were speaking about the opposite of love, that is selfishness. Selfishness is inherently static. It stays in one place.
Right.
So, I've won the Super Bowl. I never need to go to practice again. Right. Or, I've landed my dream job, whatever the case may be, or even just I am content where I'm at, which is good. Contentment ought not to turn into apathy.
I referred to it as entropy last night. The attitude that, well, this is just the way it is. It's just entropy. It has its own inertia, you just drift.
Yeah.
You keep drifting, and occasionally you collide with other people who are drifting in the same direction, and we call those people friends. But like we said, it's all just mechanics. It's just going through the motions, not alive, not dead, just existing. And then others to exist with. So I got nothing else. That kind of wraps up the sections in Cyrus that I want to cover. You got anything?
I do not. Not right now.
So as always, thank you for listening to the third episode of our new podcast that we are doing, always seeking to improve and get better and grow. If you like the podcast, please leave us a review at Apple Podcast. I think it's Apple Podcast now, not iTunes Podcast. Apple Podcast. We're on all the major platforms. And share a link to the podcast. Tag me on Instagram. Let me know that you're listening to the podcast. Promote it for us. That'd be fantastic. And as we get better, hopefully more and more stuff will be brought in. If there's a book you'd like us to read, we'd love to hear from you. Drop us an email. You can go to Anchor FM to do that. Otherwise, we'll see you next time for a brand new episode.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you.